Hey guys, this is Carrie, your watercolor misfit, and as I'm sure you already know from the thumbnail, today I'm going to be walking you through how I set up a new watercolor palette. Over Christmas break, my hubby surprised me with a bunch of new watercolor tube paints from Winsor & Newton. But as I'm sure you've already encountered some point in your journey, with new paint comes an obvious dilemma. First, do I add this paint to my current palette, or do I just start fresh and anew and reorganize my palette with the new paint? I decided to go ahead and start with a fresh palette, and today I'm going to be walking you through how I lay out my watercolor palette and why I set it up the way I do. Step number 1. Wash your palette. Before I even open up my paint tubes, I begin by washing my palette with a soft sponge in some warm water, making sure to remove any extra paint, dust, or whatnot from my palette. Make sure not to scrub too hard because you can actually damage your palette by doing this. After I'm finished washing, I then proceed to dry my palette off with a hand towel. The palette I'm using today is a rather inexpensive plastic palette that I bought several years ago. I personally like this palette because it is travel size yet contains 5 large wells to mix colors, as well as 24 spaces to organize and lay out my watercolors as I desire. Also, a fun little tidbit for you, these holes that you see down here are to stand up your brushes while you're painting. Step number 2, figuring out your layout. Okay, so the next step is to determine the layout of your colors on your palette. A lot of artists arrange their paint palettes differently, so don't think that there is only one way to set up your palette. It's more about personal preference than right or wrong. For me, I like to group my colors according to cool, warm, and neutral. After I've determined what paints I actually want in my palette, I then start lining the tubes around my palette, kind of getting an idea where I want them to be located. The reason I arrange my paints in this particular way is because I like to group complementary colors or similar colors together. As I lay out my colors, you will notice that I don't necessarily go from lightest to darkest or richer tones to less vibrant. Rather, I place the colors I use more frequently towards the center of the palette, and the colors that I use less frequently kind of closer to the outer corners of my palette. This is just something that I find that helps me. Step number 3, setting up your palette. Next, I'm going to be placing my paint inside my palette. Personally, I don't like to place a lot of paint inside my palette because I prefer to work with fresh paint from the tube. So you're probably wondering why I'm setting up a palette in the first place. Well, having a palette ready, even if it's dried paint, is an incredible tool for mixing, especially when you're trying to correct colors on paper quickly. I'll get more into that in another video about mixing watercolors. But for now, know that having a palette organized and ready to use is a valuable tool for any watercolor artist, whether you prefer to paint with wet or dried paint. Step number 4, create a color key. This is perhaps the most crucial step you will do today. Yep, even more important than the layout of your paint or even putting your paint into your palette. After you have all of your colors laid out, cut a rectangular piece of watercolor paper which could fit easily into your palette. This paper will become your color key for your palette. After you have cut out your paper, then measure with the side of your palette where the individual sections are. Next, with a pen or a pencil, write out the names of each color you desire to be placed in that section. Finally, paint the desired color where it would be located in your palette. This will help you determine what paints would work best for you while you are painting, as well as tell you the name of the paint when you need to refill it later or replace it. And that's it. It's pretty simple, but it can be intimidating if you've never set up a new palette for yourself. And that's how I set up my watercolor palette with this little template thing that fits right in here to help you figure out what colors are where. I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, please make sure to give it a like and subscribe and all that other YouTube-y stuff that you guys know so well. And I will see you next time.